European strategic autonomy. Which muscles should the EU flex? Please welcome your moderator, Ian Brzezinski.
Okay, there we are. All right. Are we going to bring in Anna Wieslander? General Claudio Graziano, Olivier de France, and Frank Hone. As was noted, I'm Ian Brzezinski, and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council from Washington, D.C., and I get to serve as moderator on this panel titled European Strategic Autonomy, Which Muscles Should the EU Flex? Now, as we all know in this community, in the GlobeSec community, transatlantic burden sharing has been an enduring issue. And over the last couple of years, we've actually seen some progress on the European side, and I speak as this as an American. We've seen an increase in defense spending. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg from NATO mentions it. Even President Donald Trump has recognized that progress is being made, albeit a lot more needs to be done. There is a real tangible increase in defense spending. And that's not the only side of Europe's efforts. The EU is getting more and more into the game of European capability, military capability. And over the last several years, we've seen some potentially, and I emphasize the word potentially, significant efforts by the EU. There's PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, to enable EU members to strengthen their military capabilities through joint defense industrial projects. There's a European Defense Fund, which promises some 13 billion euros over the next European budget cycle. There's a European Capability Development Plan to ensure that European forces are interoperable and mutually reinforcing, and I hope interoperable with NATO. And there's a coordinated annual review for defense, the CARD process, to help drive this effort forward. And despite this initial budgetary progress from European countries, there is real concern, not just in North America and in Washington, but also in parts of Europe, over where these EU initiatives are going. There are questions about the motivations behind strategic autonomy, and there's skepticism about what it will actually yield in terms of real capabilities. So, is European strategic autonomy a genuine, significant strategic catalyst for European and operational and defense industrial capacity, one that will strengthen European capabilities and the transatlantic relationship? Or is it a strategic dagger to transatlantic unity and interoperability? Could it be both? Or is this much ado about nothing? Because one could say there really isn't the political will or the resources for this initiative to do both or either. So to help us explore the potentials and pitfalls of European strategic autonomy, we've got a great panel that brings together top-level military, industrial, and policy perspectives. General Claudio Graziano is the chairman of the European Union Military Committee. He's a commissioned infantry officer of the Alpini units, the mountain units. He's raised up in command through those units to become eventually chief of the general staff of the Italian military. He's got operational experience in Lebanon, Mozambique, and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he commanded the Kabul multinational brigade. I first met him when he was defense attaché in Washington. Anna Wieslander, I've known for many years. She's the chairwoman of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. She's also a director of the Northern Europe of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, my institution. She's got great interagency experience, having served as a chief of staff to the Speaker of Parliament in senior positions in the Swedish Ministry of Defense, among others. And just this last May, she was elected a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Science, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Olivier de France is a research director at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs in Paris. He's also associated with the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's a leading thinker and analyst of European geopolitics, including the current shifts defining Europe's geopolitical landscape today. And it's no surprise he's a demanded lecturer at the Sorbonne University in Paris and Homerton College in Cambridge. And Frank Hone is the CEO of Krauss Maffei Wegmann, KMW is a leading manufacturer of armored fighting vehicles. They produce armored fighting vehicles for some 30 nations. Frank is an engineer by training and career. He joined KMW in 2003, took it over in 2006, and has led it since then. And he's been a powerful voice among those advocating for the consolidation of European defense industry and a sharp critic of redundancy and duplication in the military capabilities in Europe. So I'm going to start with the questions, but as those of you who've been at GlobeSec for a day or more know that not only can you raise your hands when we turn to the audience, but you can also submit questions to Slido through your iPhone or your smartphone. So let me start with General Graziano. The European Strategic Autonomy Initiative, is this really significant? I mean, as an operational commander, do you really see PESCO, down the pike EDF, actually yielding Europe anything that you're not getting from NATO today? Is it fulfilling gaps that are going to really change the landscape for European capabilities? Are there efforts in this initiative that are really going to address NATO shortfalls? How does it change your operational capacities today as a commander, or perhaps tomorrow?
No, thank you, and thank to all the people is here. It's a great opportunity to me to show it, to explain what is my opinion, anyway, my vision. So the strategic autonomy. The strategic autonomy is a key factor, and you explained well. Maybe has raised some ambiguity, but the answer, all what you said, the short answer is yes. It's something that is really needed. It's all about European Union to develop an independent and autonomous capability to be a global security provider, to run in a more effective way the CSDP mission, Common Security Defense Policy mission, and that means that it's not a strategic autonomy from somebody, from somewhat. It's a strategic autonomy to do something if needed, when it's appropriate and in synergy with the other security organization. First of all, with NATO. And if you go back, the fact that it's required to have a European independent autonomous capabilities, to increase these capabilities is a question that come from long time from United States, come long time from NATO. It was called sometimes European Security and Defense Initiatives. Now it's Common Security and Defense Policy, but it's an answer that can give a better situation, a better security in Europe, and to contribute to the mission and to the task of NATO. Strategic autonomy comes with the global strategy. It comes in a moment in the last 3 years in which the security and defense developments in Europe had unprecedented moved. We have now not only global strategy that address the strategic autonomy, but we also have approved some tools. You spoke about it, PESCO. We have cards, we have European defense funds that are peculiar tools in European Union that can help to increase the production, to increase the capability of European industries, but also to run better projects, better operational projects in order to fulfill the mission. And the important thing that strategic autonomy is about fulfilling what we call headline goals, or the level of ambition of the European Union. But this level of ambition is perfectly consistent with NATO. Actually, also we never saw before this discussion, this cooperation with NATO in many sides. If there are some limitations politically, but with the will and the interest of the country are there, it's present. And the strategic mission of European Union are perfectly consistent with the core task of NATO. And if you consider development of threats that is around the world, in this moment, after 2011, after the new threats from the East, the arc of crisis of East, in many ways NATO is now focusing on collective defense. So this autonomous space that remains for Europe, that is for Europe, is perfectly consistent with NATO. Because at this point we are looking at the threats, for example, from the South. We are looking at the failing states, at terrorism, how to work to support the failing state in dealing with problem of migration. That is capacity building. And trying to say European Union does have the ability to mobilize many tools. That is economical, financial, diplomatic, cooperation, also a little bit military, without moving anything by NATO. That is the most important security organization. But if you consider the level of ambition, the maximum level of ambition, the fulfillment of the maximum level of ambition of the European Union is the possibility of run peace enforcement with units that are the great definition, a single set of forces. Single set of forces are units that are good for NATO, for European Union, for United Nations. I've been all of the life a NATO officers. I deployed many years everywhere. I wish I could have European forces ready to deploy in Lebanon instead of bringing forces, etc. We are trying to do that, to have the possibility for European Union to contribute as a global providing, considering that there is a huge request also from third states. If you go to Africa, and I've been there, and they are looking for support, and they are not situations that are auto-solving, European Union, it's an organization that could do something. And it's something we have to explain better, because for us, I think it's for European, it's a milestone. No country can solve the problem alone. We want to do with NATO in cooperation, but as it was said in the famous Berlin definition, when we set the level of ambition, single set of forces, separate but non separable forces, is always what we ask in Europe and always what United States asks us.
I'd like later on to follow up on how we can demonstrate to skeptics like myself in America how the EU is actually complementing and adding to capability that would benefit the transatlantic community. But let me turn to Frank. $13 billion over what, 6 or 7 years? I mean, from your industrial perspective, is that a game changer? I think of $13 billion in the context of a $750 billion annual defense spend by the transatlantic community. This sounds like marginal chump change. How can this really drive European defense industry? You must be a little bit disappointed that the ambition is so limited.
Oh, I think we live since a long time with being disappointed. 13 billion is definitely not a game changer, but it's a beginning. I think first we have to understand what we're doing today, and I like nice talks and nice governmental signatures and the beautiful papers. Reality looks different. If I go to defense, first of all, I think Europe is a nice marketplace for the US. Today, European countries are buying for 75 billion in the US, while Americans are buying for 350 million in Europe. And that's a balance of 99.5 against 0.5%. First. Second, we Europeans are crazy people. We are running, I don't know, 5 different fighters. And I love what Florence Pauli said a few days ago in Washington. Paragraph 5 from our well-known documents doesn't mean F-35. I like that. But we still have so many aircrafts, and I'm a tanker guy. We have 20 different tanks without NATO Europe. And it's so easy. And now imagine, there are 8,000 tanks. Less than 50% have been developed, manufactured in Europe. And if I go to the artillery, which gets an increasing importance, 12% have been developed and manufactured in Europe. There is no real Europe. We have stuff from everywhere, especially from the East and the West. I think if we want to increase firepower, I remember people, and especially at this place here in Bratislava, think about the time at the Cold War. The Eastern Bloc, all nations were driving the same tank, the same aircraft, the same helicopters, the same guns, the same ammunition. They had really firepower. And today, national egoism is still there. And I love 13 billion in a European defense fund. And it looks like it is to subsidize some nations. A good system being engineered by heart is built, select the right subsystems and components to make your system superior and not ask the question where it does come from and make a balance on the money that everybody could participate in the same way. 13 billion again, right start. I don't believe that over the next decade or 2 decades we have a chance to reach somewhere and being much better than we are as of today. It's a long path, it's breathtaking, and I would love to see deeds and not longer words and papers.
So if I could just reiterate, you like the idea they're moving in this direction, but from a defense industry perspective, you're not sure, you're not confident that 13 billion or 50 billion will actually lead to the kind of consolidation or rationalization you're looking for in European defense industry.
The honeypot is too small.
Honeypot is too small. Thank you. Anna, strategic autonomy. Against autonomy from whom? I mean, one of the things that has riled people in America is this phrase. It sounds anti-American. It's interesting that strategic autonomy was rolled out 2 days after Brexit. It seemed almost a French opportunistic effort to kind of leverage an opportunity to kind of diminish American influence. What's driving ESDI, strategic autonomy in Europe? Is it skepticism about America? Is it increased doubt about America? Or is it rooted in transatlanticism and desire to do what's right to carry their fair share of the security burden?
Thank you, Ian. Well, I would like to start like this. I think, fundamentally, it's a good thing that Europe takes its security more seriously. At one point, we have to make this shift. It's more than 70 years since World War II ended. We were a prosperous continent and so on. We've been having this conversation with the US for many, many years. So what we see now is a starting point for that, and I think it's good. My problem is rather that I don't think we take security seriously enough yet. So if you look at Europe and the title, which was intriguing of this seminar of can the EU flex its muscles or whatever? I mean, there is muscle mass when you look at Europe. We have capabilities, but we don't have perhaps the right muscles developed, and we certainly don't have the reflexes to flex those muscles. And why don't we have that? We don't have this sense of urgency still, and I think that I think the Americans can sense that. And why don't we have it? I think the EU has a problem because, in this sense, or it's new for the EU, because the EU was not meant to deal with defense. It has never been part of the EU DNA to deal with defense. Security, yes, a bit, but not defense, really. So we are entering into a new paradigm, basically, for the EU, and that's important. And what's important there is that the EU is used to playing win-win all the time. That's the strategy, the discourse for the EU. And if you look at the global strategy, that's also the attempt of the global strategy. But if you move into defense, defense is about protecting hard power, and that could be about win-lose. And increasingly you hear this, that the EU must be able to actually protect its citizens, protect the interests of its member states in a world of great power competition, and we have to play another game of hard power. And how can we do that? So I think that's where we are, and this is all new to us. The EU is a soft superpower now entering another game, so to say. And here we becomes a bit lost in translation. That's where all these concepts now emerge that we are discussing in the EU. Strategic autonomy, what does it mean? Political, operational, industrial autonomy, it's very confusing. European army, there is a European Security Council, there is possibly a Defense Council. There are lots of various concepts that we like to discuss. But on the other hand, that's good, but I don't think we really have the time to discuss all of that either, because it has been mentioned here, exposés of the threats we are facing. That's one, this is going on now, challenges that the EU must face. Another thing is that it takes 20 years to develop these capabilities that we are talking about and that you are questioning that we are having. So if we don't start now and keep on discussing or putting on the table what we might have at home or what we have already developed with a neighboring country, then time passes and we don't get anywhere when it comes to true capability and handling things. And that, I think, is another thing that we really have to address now as well. And we do have a complete dependency on the US to handle a major crisis of war, despite all the nice rhetoric about a defense community or a European Defense Union by 2025 and so on. So here we need to move on, and I will end this by saying that we need leadership, I think, on a different level, both within the EU, and actually I would like to see it also, to challenge you back a bit. You know, you've been critical towards Europe, but also in DC, I think you can have another kind of leadership. I would like the Europeans to be more, take initiative, to talk more about burden sharing in real means. What does it mean? What do we do? What do we do? Do we do the patrolling on the Mediterranean or up in the Guic Gap? Or, you know, are we first responders or are you first responders? So what does this mean when a crisis actually occurs? We could initiate that. Macron and Merkel could initiate that with Trump, for instance, representing the whole of the EU. And another issue of importance, I think, is technology, innovation. What do we mean with this now, research and development money? Are we competitors with the US, or are we friends still? And how do we meet common competitors, perhaps? That's also an interesting discussion to have. So here I would like to see much more, you know, serious discussions. And on the American side, sometimes I get the feeling it's a bit grouchy. There, you know, it's, you know, this is good, but on the other hand, what is it all about? Is it San Malo again in the 1990s? Haven't we just solved this once and for all, EU-NATO cooperation? I think America has to realize also that this is not the 90s. America is not dictating the rules of the world anymore. America needs allies and partners more than ever, and I think this is a great opportunity to get a more potent partner in global affairs for the US. The US could support that much more constructively, and that way we could work together.
So you see this as being driven by virtuous objectives, not divisive objectives. It's an effort to increase European capabilities, but also transatlantic capabilities.
I would like to see it like that, yes. And also, I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you look at NATO and EU countries, it's the same countries. We're talking about the same capabilities to a large extent, but we're making this into a huge discussion.
You know, when I think about that, you were asking about the American perspective, I see a spectrum. I see a spectrum of criticism. On the one side, there are operators and strategists who are concerned about double hatting of capabilities. So if something's tied to the EU and to NATO, can NATO really rely on it? There's a school of thought, and these are all overlapping, that just anti-EU. Those are those who support Brexit and such, and see the EU as a bureaucracy out of control. And so anything that's EU, they dislike. There's some in the industrial side that look at this as an effort to kind of deny US business access to EU funds. And then there's also a side that's completely dismissive, that, you know, we shouldn't worry about this because this is irrelevant. They've never gotten there over the last 20 years. We go back to Sam Malo. I see Jim Townsend. He was somewhere in the audience. He and I were working on this back in 2001, 1999, and what has it yielded? Not much. It's dismissive. That actually bothers me because I think the EU is very capable of doing things, and I'm a skeptic because I'm concerned that actually the EU can do things. We've seen what it's done across Europe. So let me turn to Olivier. You know, on this question of, you know, is this much about ado about nothing? When I look back to Saint Malo and I saw the arguments for it, you know, this is the way to get the Europeans to spend more, it yielded nothing in terms of real capability. If anything, it created new institutions, it created collisions within Brussels, between NATO and the EU. Why is this different? Why should we be more confident that this is actually going to yield capabilities that are going to significantly enhance Europe's ability to be a fair carrier of the security burden that it in the United States has to carry with effectiveness today?
Oh, thanks, Ian. And I must say I agree with Anna in this respect. Is the fact that we're actually talking about muscle and EU in the same sentence, and that this is the way we've actually framed the conversation, is a pretty good hint to answer your question. I mean, I can say this because I've come over here from Paris, and in Paris we tend to be a bit too maybe intellectual about this debate, and we like to discuss the theological aspects, the ideological aspects, the kind of EU-NATO duplication, European army, and so on. But actually, for a while now, both I think, in Brussels, in Paris, and perhaps also in Berlin, the European defence conversation has taken a turn, a more pragmatic turn, and I think this is a good thing. It works. It should be welcomed, and that's the way we should continue to go. The fact that we're asking, which muscles should the EU flex? I mean, you can't flex the muscles if you don't have muscles in the first place. Sorry to be trivial, but it means that we've actually been basically talking. The cycle really started in 2013. If you look at the conclusions of the European Council of December 2013, you'll see it's pretty rich on the muscle, actually. It talks about SATCOM, it talks about cyber, it talks about drones, it talks about air-to-air refueling, and that kind of started a cycle. And credit to where it's due. I mean, the EU doesn't usually talk so much about capabilities and talk so much about the muscle, and it started a cycle where, to my mind, we are now with the European Defence Fund and the fact that we, for the first time in history, have fresh funds to spend on European capability. And this is what I don't completely agree with you, Frank, because I think 13 billion is basically, it's the first time in history we've been able to do that. So obviously the honeypot is always going to be too small, but I think it's definitely a good first step. And the reason for this kind of change of state of mind is that, I suppose, in Paris, we decided that at some point we're going to stop with the statements of intent. We're going to stop with the nice documents with the nice signatures and so on, the overblown rhetoric, and we're just going to knuckle down. And we focus on what works, on the capabilities, basically, on the muscle, and the new motto is whatever works. I think to a certain extent this happened in Berlin as well. I mean, maybe a tiny bit later, from the Munich Security Conference in 2014 onwards, where we decided to take defense a bit more seriously and to actually take defense capabilities as something that you could actually use in terms of defense output, not just for political reasons, and not just for to rebuild the cohesion of the EU. Now, obviously, there's a long way to go because the numbers that are usually quoted, that you can't use any submarines in Germany, or you've got 4 out of 128 Eurofighters that you can actually use. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but that's the way the conversation is focused. So, for me, that's a reason to believe that this time it's slightly different, because the conversation hasn't started with the brain, it started with the muscle. And usually we spend a bit too much time on the brain and not enough time on the muscle. And do remember that between 2008 and 2013, basically, it was mar ne plein, as we say in France. There was nothing. European leaders didn't even talk about defense. So the fact that we're A, talking about defense, and B, framing the question in terms of the muscle, and not only the brain, not only the ideology, not only the theology, I think it has worked. It's shown it has worked, because the way we are, where we are with the European Defence Fund, for me, shows that we're on the right path. So that's the way we should continue. And actually, to be a bit provocative, there's another school of thought. There's a fifth one, if you like. Once you have the muscles, once you have the capabilities, who cares in which framework you're going to use them? If you don't have any, you can't use them. If you have them, you can use them in whatever framework you want: national context, bilateral context, multinational, EU context, or NATO context. And to finish with the provocative part, I mean, who cares what the US think? Who cares what Donald Trump thinks? Donald Trump thinks about his interest, and maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. He's thinking about American interests, and that's what he should protect and promote. But why can't the EU do the same? Why can't the EU have its own interests and promote and protect them? This is my question.
Yeah, if I may, just what changed?
You're defending me, right?
Yeah, no. What changed after 2001? I mean, now there is a window of opportunity. In 2001, NATO was able to deal with international cooperation, with crisis management, starting deploying a rapid reaction corps. Now, after 2011, many things changed. Before Lisboa, we had something. After, we had a different NATO. Now there is a different situation international. NATO is focusing on collective defense. There is a window of opportunity to restart where we stayed with new projects. And this one, as she said, to build a system, you need 20 years. In reality, probably you need 30. For the moment you start the research, development, procurement, etc., you need 30. And the money we are speaking, 13 million, it's on research and development. not in procurement. So is where the industrial base is lacking in Europe, because in reality the research and development is costly. So this one is a boost for the industry that is in competition with the United States, because still many systems will come from there, but then can support these kind of things. To do something in this moment, we should buy off the shelf, because at this point, to have something fastly is only off the shelf or update the current system. So we are now also working on the organizational side to be more effective and more efficient, to have the possibility to run the CSDP in a constructive manner, but to support these kind of things, the only organization that can do it at the end of the day is European Union, and if you do it also for NATO, because the capability development plan is coherent with the NATO development plan. And what you prepare in one side is ready for the other side, the same people.
Everyone who has questions, please raise your hands. I've seen 2 or 3 already, and also feel free to also use Slido. I have someone behind there. Fantastic. Let me just quickly respond to Olivia. You know, why should America care? Because we've got 30,000.
Why should Europe care?
Why should Europe care what America? Because we've got 30,000 U.S. troops in Europe. We've stood with Europe and risked our blood on behalf of Europe. And so I think it's fair to ensure that our military capacities are developed in a coordinated and efficient way to enhance deterrence, to enhance collaboration, and to minimize the prospects for inefficiency on the battlefield or political division between our governments. Let me now turn to the audience. That's my friend from Sven from Estonia. Will have the first shot.
Well, thank you. In Sven Sakova, CDS Tallinn. About muscles and everything, I might agree that Europe has muscles, but it seems to me that it lacks both central nervous system and the spine. And what I mean by that is that, look at the Libya air war. How was Europe doing in terms of enablers? Very basic things also, in terms of the precision ammunition and so forth. Had nothing. They really. Divergent strategic cultures mean basically muscles for what? What are you going to do? European unions are looking in that very different directions, and there is no one big power providing that strategic culture for the whole continent. And so, rhetoric question was asked, who cares what Trump thinks? I would say that countries on the front line do care, because we are always one tweet away from a dissolution of NATO. It can happen like that. And why that matters is that really the US puts its money where the mouth is. Without radically increased defense spending in Europe, I would say all the talk about the ESA and so forth is just hot air, because it's $13 billion. It's also not coming from outside of Europe. It's still European defense money. It's just kind of we reshuffle the money from one pocket to another and think it's progress. In terms of a GDP defense spending ratio, actually progress has been minimal. The progress has been done in the Eastern Front, small countries, small economies. Bigger ones which matter in terms of aggregate do not. Because of the economic growth, it looks good. And until now, Trump is happy, until one day he's not. And then we'll have a problem. I did not have a question.
Olivia, did you want to respond?
Well, to be honest, it's if you take I don't agree with the 13 billion. If you try and have an intellectual exercise where you think of the EU as a country. Now we agree it's not a country, but the 13 billion is basically rising the amount of GDP that the EU, if it were a country, is spending on defense, and raising a national percentage of GDP is the same as you're reshuffling money from one to the other. But the EU is basically that's what it's doing as well. So that was my.
Let me follow on the third. Go ahead, Anna, please.
No, I just wanted to add on that discussion on capabilities and what's lacking, enablers, as the experiences we have from international missions for many years. We know that strategic airlift and it's air-to-air refueling and it's ISR, and these are identified since way back. We also have the NATO planning process, where we have identified, if you start looking more at territorial defense, how to protect European territory, you have to add on air defense systems and other things that are lacking. So you have high impact, big capability gaps, which is, I think, very natural for the EU and NATO to address this kind of thinking on when it comes to operational strengthening of capabilities. Then you have the industrial market, which is basically a little bit of another track, creating more of collaborative efforts on the industrial markets. So you have to also look at those two a bit differently when it comes to initiatives that are lacking. But my point is that I think there are pretty well-defined gaps that we could address that would make us more into potent enablers. I think that also would land well in the United States, because I think one perspective of the United States looking at Europe and listening to this discussion that we have is that the United States has been a warfighting nation for many years, so you actually need capabilities to win wars. That's how you view things. Europe has not done that for many years. In that sense, we've done international missions. That's not the same thing. And here we have a discrepancy, I think, that we need to merge.
You're speaking music to my ears, because when I see European defense collaboration, I'm fired up, actually. If Europe can produce more capabilities, why should the United States get in the way of that? We should embrace that. But I'm really worried about the level of ambition of this initiative. When I think of strategic shortfalls, maybe I did too much in my NATO lens. I think of ISR. I think of integrated air and missile defense. I think of air-to-air refueling. I think of long-range fires. This is what's needed in this new age, particularly of great power competition. Yet when I look at PESCO, I see little pet projects. When I look at $13 billion, I don't see anything that could even address one of these NATO shortfalls. And if these are NATO shortfalls, these are de facto European shortfalls. Am I wrong? Am I missing the big picture here?
No, from my point of view, totally right. And if you look on the programs, if it takes 20 years to get something done, and this is the average if we go for a big shot new program, maybe we say it takes 10 years in planning. And if I look on the new future combat aircraft system, should be finished in 2045. New tank, 2035, 16 years from now. Being a tanker guy, I know some about the requirements that Star Wars Series 2458 means exactly we will be late a decade. That's average, a decade late. People vote, we just had a European election, and you've seen what happens to Europe, which really is breathtaking. We should bring something now to the table, and fast. And so we went to Brussels, being industry, showing up with a European armory house. Take tanks from nations they don't need, upgrade them maybe or not, and give these tanks to nations which need them or think that they need them, and they need them fast and not in 20 years from now. And then Europe will show that it brings security to the table. And that means deeds, no words. So we make these proposals, but I'm not sure when they will materialize. It takes that long, and people are voters in Europe, throughout Europe, and I think we have seen that, are not happy. And if Europe takes on security, defense as a real hardcore mission, this will bring people back to the table.
That can be a PESCO project. PESCO is a fresh one, started 2 years ago. Enthusiastic, it's a framework of possibility that are both operational and industrial based. Of course, now we are trying to make it more concrete. There are the fourth report, but is one of the way. And of course, if it is about research and development, it go far. If it goes to other upgrades, then can be a PESCO initiatives. PESCO initiative, it's a matter of cooperation within countries. To be more concrete, of course, the problem is that we have to overtaken the member states' reluctance to mobilize this idea, to come back to an idea of being within European identity that is promoting the national identity and supporting the transatlantic link. And what is in the level of ambition, to say that, what is the level of ambition in Europe is maybe project a core, is not going for something that is doing NATO, etc. But at this level, that is in the line goals, it is in the project, is something we can make concrete. And when we sit with Chod in the military committee, are more or less the same, NATO and European Union, and everybody is thinking we want to fill gap in NATO and European Union, and we are understanding time after time that is a window of opportunity, that if we miss this one, what we have, an alternative to European Union and to NATO? No, we don't. So we have to work on it with the research and development, and 13 million is going to be 50%, if you tell me more or less, of the project. So other had to come from the country, and when it become 40 million in the research and development, that is something. Okay, it's for the future. Now with PESCO we can think to the present, but if we don't think to it, in any case we need the CSDP, and the threats from the south will remain. And we are, otherwise we are dealing in not organized well.
Let me take a question from the audience. Ma'am?
Thank you. Tanja Lacic, from the Research Center of the European Parliament. I wanted to come back to the main concept of this panel, strategic autonomy, and to pick up on the defensive reactions which have occurred outside of Berlin, Paris, and Brussels most often. So if we look at the concept itself, strategic autonomy, strategy, what is strategy? To define your interest, and then to define what means you need to achieve those interests, and then to define in what situations you are willing to act upon them and to use these means to achieve those interests. So I'm just thinking, why should the EU be accused of wanting to do that? How is this not beneficial for the transatlantic relationship? How is this not beneficial to NATO to have a stronger European pillar? So my question is, what is being a good ally? Is it buying American? Thank you.
Olivier, do you want?
Preaching to the choir. I actually think that the EU doesn't do this enough. I actually think that, you know, if you look at all the initiatives that are on the table, we're juxtaposing a kind of a horizontal array of initiatives, from, you know, PESCO to the EDF to the MPCC and to CARD and all this. What we lack at the minute is actually the strategic level coherence, the vertical coherence, the clarity, the transparency of what the EU wants to do with all this, and that comes with basically my question is, who's in charge within the EU of deciding that? And my problem is that the EU is not strategic enough, and should do much more to define its interests, and then to work out what the priorities are, what the preoccupations are, what the threats are, and then apply that downstream to the muscle. And the problem is, you know, even when so a variety of actors do this, so you've got, you know, sorry to people here, but you've got the EDA, you've got the Commission, you've got the High Representative. So everybody basically is doing that in their corner, but the problem is that when actually someone comes up with a roadmap of what the EU's interests are and what its role on the global stage should be, then the European Council welcomes it. It doesn't even endorse it, which is what happened with the EU Global Strategy in 2016. So my question is, who is in charge of defining what those interests are and then applying it downstream to the muscle? And for me, this is the vertical clarity that we need, the strategic clarity. And for me, it's basically getting all the European leaders in one room and getting them to decide on, you know, the levels of priority of, you know, different preoccupations, different threats, and then how it goes, that translates into the muscle, into the capabilities and the industrial base that we need to build those capabilities. And for the moment, that's not happening. So I wish the EU would actually be even perhaps more political and more strategic, not less. And my last point would be, okay, if you have these kind of the muscle, the spine, the reflexes, NATO is the military brain, and I think nobody contests that. I mean, in France, people basically consider that NATO is there for collective defense. Article 5 is there for collective defense. But does that mean that we can't have a political brain? I mean, the EU is a different type of actor. It has a more political brain. It has a variety of levers, of means to ensure its interests. And maybe we should allow for, you know, a political brain to be able to translate its own objectives, its own interests into these muscles, and to basically know why it's flexing those muscles, and not let it only be dictated by the military brain, which is absolutely necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. Because the crisis that we're facing obviously have a military aspect, but they have a whole load of other aspects which are economic, diplomatic, and which the EU is pretty well suited for.
I think you hit the hub of the issue, which is when it comes to the transatlantic relationship and European strategic autonomy. Shouldn't there be a more effective division of labor between the alliance and the EU? The EU is a great organization from my point of view. You know, it's helped spread freedom in Europe. It's helped consolidate democracy across Europe. It's been a driver of economic growth. It's been a key engine in terms of reconciliation and partnership, just the way NATO has. But its strengths are in the political and economic realms. It's never really been in the military realms. And this may take offense to our colleague here, but I'm most discomforted by European military structures and most heartened by European defense industrial capacities. And what I worry about is when we start creating political institutions or roles that go beyond what I would call the traditional European rule, you start politicizing defense in the transatlantic realm. And the classic misuse of resources is the German decision on F-35. I can't understand that. And I'd be interested in your reaction to that. The F-35. Italy buys the F-35. Denmark buys the F-35. Netherlands buys the F-35. Yet Germany, one of the most significant powers in Europe, decides to forego that. I have to say it's not on objective military reasons, but on purely political reasons. It could have easily split its aircraft acquisition between a European platform and F-35. And what has it done? It's basically relegated itself to a second-tier air force. It's not going to be a transatlantic player in NATO because it's denying itself the stealth and new fifth-generation capabilities. It's not being a good European player because it can't even do, down the pike, military operations with those countries that are flying F-35. I mean, that to me is what happens when you have a politicization of security policy and a politicization of military capabilities that comes with creating EU defense structures. Am I wrong? You're nodding your head in disagreement.
I'm afraid I don't agree, and I think I defer to Frank's opinion on this, but if Germany buys the F-35, the European defense industry is dead, basically.
It could have split the buy. Anna?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I understand the German perspective when it comes to this, because you can't have a project like the FCAS and then buy F-35 at this point, because F-35 as a system goes well also with taking the time perspective again. You buy into an aircraft system 20, 30 years, perhaps renewal, and at that point the FCAS is supposed to be materialized. So, and you know, you just don't, so I can understand why you make a temporary solution and then you can't initiate projects like German, French, someone has to buy into them, and I think if Americans sat down and looked at this, I think they would understand it because you would do the same.
I agree.
I think, first of all, I will be the lobbyist of F-35 if the Americans decide to buy my Leopard.
There you are.
It's that
Good
easy,
for you.
Okay? No, I think decisions on security should be made on superior systems and what is needed. And if you buy a superior system and being a nation, a big nation, you have to know what's inside the black box. And as long as you don't get the inside of a black box, how does that fit to the future? Because in the future you have to make upgrades and put something on top of it, and communication system, cyber attacks, whatever. The question is, are the boxes always open? And we had in the past no trust within NATO. I'm sorry to say, not between Europe and the US. It's also between France and Germany. French eyes only, German eyes only. And if I look in FCAS and MGCS and all these battles, they talk about IPRs, which box will be opened and not. You have so many aspects and you have to be clear. Once again, I will be the best lobbyist for F-35 if America decides to buy the Leopards.
Point taken. I'm revving up my Leopard. Man.
Jana Polierin from the German Council on Foreign Relations. I have a question, but I have to share my confusion with you first, because in the panel before with Phil Rieker, he said that the American problem with kind of European defense right now is third-party participation, and with EDF and PESCO. So Ian, now you said that PESCO was just a couple of little pet projects, and the EDF was just 30 billion peanuts. So I mean, I'm the only one in the room who sees kind of a contradiction here. I mean, either it's super important and the US has to join, or it's just little pet projects and peanuts, and then why is that so important to the United States? But that was a question to the moderator. I don't know if that's fair or if that's possible. But the question to the others is the European Commission has become quite interested in the topic of European defense. There is even kind of the thought to establish a DG defense. Is that a good idea or isn't that a good idea? What should be the role of the Commission in all that? Thanks.
Anna, you want to take that? Commission?
Commission? Yeah, I think it's a pretty natural development actually to have a DJ for defense. We have EDA, but I mean the history of EDA and the creation of EDA came with UK blocking, and as it develops, I mean you might keep EDA to some extent, but I think moving towards, if you have actually, I mean this 13 billion euro that we're talking about, whether it's big or small, I think another dimension of that is that it's European taxpayers' money for the first time going to, you collect those money, so Sweden will transfer money there. You know, in the first time, who takes care of that common pot? So usually those money, they are distributed through the Commission. And you have to report back to your constituency in Sweden, you know, what happened to those taxpayers' money that, you know, to those money that I paid in taxes and then went to Brussels, how did it come back to my country and other countries? So you have that mechanism of it. Is it a big or small sum? And and that's the big shift for us in the EU, that, you know, we're now entering a new phase when it comes to that mechanism. So I think it makes sense to have more of a Commission distributing. Also, another point there is important in this sense, and that has to do with France and Germany. Because even though France and Germany are the engine in this project, it cannot be just a French-German endeavor. It has to involve all member states if it's supposed to be an EU thing. And who can make sure of that? Of course, the leadership of Germany and France and other countries getting involved, having ideas, getting into the discussion. But then also you have the EU institutions. That's a traditional role of them to make sure that this is a broad, inclusive project.
I mean, and it's very much important because security and defense, CSDP, is about inclusiveness. So it's important that the 28 countries are involved and they are supporting. And it's a transformation, as we see, as long as the European Union is looking more to the CSDP, we need change in the organization. All the organizations have been changing during the time, has changed NATO. And now there is adaptation of European Union looking to this aspect. I don't know what the Commission is going to do, but of course the important things, under my point of view, is the role of the military, of the European Military Committee, of the military staff, that is to provide honest military advice to the decision making, in order that the requirement of the end of users, that are the CHOD, that there are the military component, is rightly addressed. So the important thing is that there is this consideration that is also something new, because the military component is not the biggest one in European Union, but this point is becoming, let's say, more visible because it's more important the CSDP, is more important the global strategy, the strategy autonomy, and I think that in our environment we can move, of course, step by step, and when it's important is to find the common denominator to proceed and to go forward.
Let me follow up on the question on the access to the $13 billion. I want to turn to Frank. And Frank, the perception I have is, because you were asking also what my view is, I'm actually uncomfortable with Americans going in and demanding that they have a right to EU funds. To me, it strikes a little bit hypocritical. With that said, I think the EU may be making a mistake by precluding that opportunity, because that's basically denying itself some cutting-edge technology, albeit from my country, but from potentially from the UK and others. What's your view on that issue?
Just only a few words. What is Europe? And I'm an industrial guy. Europe has a lack of leadership, one. Second, defense in Europe is a cherry-picking community. I once painted a pasta picture. It's called, for my assistant, if I ask, give me my pasta picture, it says, who is member of EU, member of NATO, member of OCA, member of EDA. You always will find different nations. It's like cherry picking, and my saying is, if you look on this, on all the activities, the NATO, EU, OCA, EDA, whatever we have, it's so many security initiatives. It's 100. Everything staffed different with different nations. I always said if Putin gets aware of my pasta picture, he knows he will with his tanks at the North Sea in the Netherlands before we made a decision, because too many institutions have to talk to each other. And I want to respond on IDA. And I really like Jorge Domek, and I like the approach, but what is IDA, the European Defense Agency? My saying, simple, everything between a nice castle in the air and a straight jacket. How could he shape the future? What is his budget? He could produce paper and not reality. Why do we have OCA and IDA? Why don't we collect everything together? Give him money. Let him buy things for nations who need something. Give him firepower. Without money, paper pushing. So look on all security initiatives, and we spend too much on that, on all these organizations. Let's focus and make clear what we need and when we need it. I don't think that it makes sense to talk about fighters in 2045 plus 10 years delay is 2055, from now is 35 years. That doesn't make sense. But let's cooperate on an open base and not keep secrets. National egoism kills and destroys a security initiative overall in NATO and in EU. And this is what we are dealing on a daily basis, and it starts with export regulations. Who entitles whom to sell what, where? Stupid. Make an organization in Brussels. They should decide for Europe, or make a decision in NATO, whom we deliver our weapons. It should be not depend on national egoism. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to reserve one. I'm going to give the last audience to Dan Fried, Ambassador Dan Fried.
So I've been listening to similar debates like this for 25 years. And I have, a question and / advice for the Europeans who are enthusiastic about a European defense. If you want to shut up the Americans and really kind of stomp on us and win this debate, don't talk about the capacity at conferences like this. Build it and then use it. And by use it, I mean, why not, if NATO relations with Georgia or Ukraine are stuck, go out and build a military relationship there, or run freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. I'm throwing that out partly to be provocative, but only partly. What do you want to use it for? And then do it, and you will get the Americans to absolutely shut up. I remember a conversation in the Bush administration when somewhere at the beginning of the second Bush term, people in the White House decided that they had enough on their plate without fighting with the Europeans about the theology of European defense. And the problem, we stopped fretting about it. So my point is, build it, use it. And last thought, I can think of an example of a significant and successful European-led, although not EU, but European-led military intervention that was so successful it was completely forgotten. It was the intervention in Albania in March 1997. Italy led it, France backed it up, the Americans quietly lended some resources, it stabilized the country, and it worked. Those are the kinds of capacities that Europe could use. So, don't try to win the argument at discussions like this. Win it on the ground, and the Americans will shut up and go away.
Amen. I actually wanted to kind of close on that theme, following Dan's thought here. I wanted to put on my good hat and say, Ian the European, what would I do to go over to Washington and convince that this is actually a good idea, that European defense industry, a strong European defense industry, more importantly, strong European military forces under an EU flag is effective? Officially say still skeptical of that, but if I want to convince someone myself, I would follow Dan's point. And I'd be interested in asking each of you, what do you think the EU can do to do that? I have a couple of ideas. One, next year is going to be the first US Defender exercise. We're going to do a division-level exercise with US forces. Over a brigade is going to be transferred over, I think, to Poland or somewhere in Europe for a division-level exercise. Why doesn't the EU put into the game a battle group? When has a EU battle group ever been used? What a great way to demonstrate its relevance and utility. What about an EU battle group deploying to NATO's eastern frontier? Is that possible? What about an EU battle group going over and training in the National Training Center, NTC, in California? What a way to demonstrate deployability. Transatlanticism. What a way to kind of bring up the readiness levels through that very aggressive training facility out there. Are these in the realm of possible for the EU? Or is that a pipe dream because the resources and political commitment isn't there?
No, as you said, this one is it's a provocation, rightly. And it's correct, because under Berlin Plus, it was possible to use normally the NATO structure for European mission. It's still alive. Now there are some political issues within some nations that make difficulties. One is everything is possible, but has to be solved at the political level. So we have to go step by step with the situation we have today, and according to the situation we have today, that become credible what you are doing in the strategic autonomy and supporting NATO. That also, because all the international organization does have some problems. And about the movement of the troops, that is something that maybe personally I can even like. We are working in a project is military mobility to put together NATO requirements, European requirements, European funds, and make possible the movement of forces. And in this, we are accomplishing some European NATO requirement with European funds. And it's going to be maybe a great thing that will restart many others. So there are real projects, there are real activity, but we have to trust on it, and after that there are also political issues that have been solved in different arena. When you say there are many organizations, there are many organizations. I mean, we have, when we are the military committee, a military committee with permanent member, plus with partner country, another one plus NATO country, another one with the European aspiration nation, but is what globalization is about. I mean, we are dealing a lot with partner country far in the east, because we have a anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden, in the Indian Ocean, with the participation of Korean, with the participation of other country. And that is what we are moving. The new use of battle group, they require a new concept. We are working on it to make strategic reserve, maybe, to act more effectively. And we have to remember that also we have many rapid reaction corps of NATO. That is the moment are ready to move, but they are not honestly moving. So we have to make more efficient everything. And be careful, because when you say, let's make separation labor, that has not to duplicate. We have to be able to, we need a single set of forces. The single forces of the European quarter remain small in order to run the operations that are credible in the line goals. And after that, they use, like Albania, he said, who knows, when I went to UNIFIL, I wish, as I said, I wish I could have battle group with me. At the time, we didn't have. Maybe in the future we could have.
Okay. Well, you know, when you mentioned military mobility, I think that's a great role for the EU in security, particularly in this part of the world where the roads on the north-south axis are completely lacking, and that inhibits the ability of the transatlantic community to defend this region. But couldn't the EU at least make a commitment, political commitment in a year or two to deploy a battle group for a NATO mission? Anna?
That's possible. I think it's a bit of a troll in the battle groups, so that might be, a negative thing. But I have two suggestions. I think I would like to repeat my idea of a serious burden-sharing meeting between European leaders and Mr. Trump, with 10 concrete suggestions on, what does burden sharing really mean? What do we do? What do you do? And then you can discuss that. That's a topic for a meeting. The second thing is that the Europeans could commit within NATO to fill the gaps in the readiness initiative, 30 warships, 30 battalions, and 30 air squadrons within 30 days. So if you commit to that, that would be a strong thing. It would also develop a European pillar within NATO in a more natural way. I think that would be a good thing.
In all respect to Olivier and Frank, I'm being told I've run over time. It's my mistake. I want to thank you all for this discussion.
Thank you.
And bearing with me as the ugly American here on this issue of strategic autonomy. Thank you. I'll ask my panel to leave, and I'm going to introduce Steve Erlanger from the New York Times. Frank, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Anna. How are you? Hello.
Everyone just stay, and we're going to go right into the next section.
Stay in your seats. How are you?
Steve.
How did it go?
Good.
Yeah?
We had, I think, a robust discussion on strategic autonomy. But now you're going to be entering great power competition.
Yes, exactly. We're going to talk about whether there's a new global order and what's happening to the old one. And maybe I will ask people to think about, after we finish talking, whether there'll be any global order left at all in 50 years.
Well, as long as there's strategic autonomy here, I think they'll be happy.
Okay.
Good
Nice
luck.
to see you, man. Great. Thank you. So, I would like to introduce, first of all, thank you for your patience. It's in the round, so it's slightly awkward, but those of you who see the back of my head, I apologize. It's white, I'm afraid. I'd like to introduce my wonderful panel. It is a great pleasure. I live in Brussels. The American ambassador to the EU is Gordon Sondland, and he's coming out. There is Hongjin Yu, Mr. Yu, who is a former vice minister of the International Department and the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Yu, and now is involved with the People's Association for Peace and Disarmament in Beijing. Martina Larkin, who is with the World Economic Forum Davos, works on Europe and Eurasia. And last, I don't know where anyone wants to sit. Here, good. And then last, Bobolo, who's an old friend, who's a Russian research fellow at the French Institute for National Affairs in Paris and the Lowy Institute in Sydney.
That's it?
So, I think. So let's have a seat.
Hey.
And we'll begin. We have an hour, and we'll try to be quick and interesting. The title of this is...
You want me to stay?
We can vote you off the island
Okay.
later. It's Partners, Competitors, and Rivals, the Future of Global Order. I've always thought that global orders, like relationships, kind of can get stale. It happened to the Congress of Vienna, but that took 100 years. It happened after World War I. The Versailles World Order didn't last very long. We had a post-World War II order where the United States was about the only big power left standing. And then we've had the post-Cold War order. And yet, everything seems to be cracking. Somehow there's a lot of confusion. We worry about a more aggressive Russia. We worry about a rising China. Maybe we celebrate a rising China. But it changes the way I think we look at the world, and it changes the way I think people in Europe perhaps look at themselves. So I'm going to ask some questions to our panel, and then we'll try to have a discussion. Ambassador Sondland, you are representing the United States to the European Union, one country against 28 for the moment, or together with 28. President Trump sometimes sees the European Union as an economic competitor or foe. I'm not sure if he really means it, but maybe he does. But in a way, what I want to ask you is, how do you see a future world order? Is it more America first, Russia first, China first? Is it more competitive, or is it collaborative, do you think?
I think it's both. And I think that President Trump sees Europe as a competitor, not a foe. And I say competitor in the best sense of the word, where two businesses compete. They're both great businesses. They both are growing the technology. They're growing the market together. But it's in many ways can be a zero-sum game in that a dollar that goes to one business may go to the other as well, but it may not. And I think that what President Trump is trying to solve for is that for multiple administrations past President Trump's, or prior to President Trump's term in office, the structural imbalance between the United States and the European Union as an entity has grown. Regulation in the European Union has proliferated in an exponential fashion, whereas I would say regulation in the United States has been a little bit more linear. And the trade deficit has gone up. And I know the first thing that's going to happen when I say that is people say, well, it's the trade deficit is due to savings rates, and it's due to this, and it's due to that. It's not due to the fact that the European Union sells more products to the United States than the United States sells to Europe. But that's not true. That is exactly what is occurring.
What I'd love to just try to press you on is, do you think this new attitude, put it that way, toward the European Union, which is the threatening of auto tariffs and other things to bring the back, will this produce a stronger Western trading bloc, or do you think it will weaken it?
Let me go back and answer your question in a little longer way.
Not too much.
Quickly, I recently had a meal with a former EU ambassador, a member of the other party, a very liberal person who served a liberal administration. And I asked him, I told him what I was experiencing, and I wanted his advice and counsel because I respect him deeply, even though we have many political disagreements. And basically what he told me was, while his president was liked more by the EU from a personality standpoint, he had the same issues that we're having, exactly the same. They were no different. And he said he wished that his president had taken it upon himself to fix things because they wouldn't be as bad as they are today.
Okay.
I'm speaking strictly of the trade.
Clearly. Okay, good. Mr. Yu, I'll try to speak slowly because understand he's having translation through his earpiece. Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi began with a very nice relationship. Now it's a bit tenser. I mean, much as with the European Union, the Trump administration is pressing China for a better deal on trade, pushing China to behave better in the World Trade Organization. How does China view this? Do you view this as a wrong-headed, is it an offense to China? Or do you see it as a way in the end that China's role in the global world order may even be better?
Well, this question, I must say, the whole world is attaching great importance to this question. During this whole day, I've been hearing a lot of experts talking about this issue, the escalation of China-US trade frictions, or even trade war. Well, this is not something that Chinese people want to see. But however, Mr. Trump is adopting some pressure on China. They want China to accept the U.S. policies as a whole. This is not in line with the international rules because we are partners indeed. When there are problems in our economic and trade relations, this is just normal. But the economic order or economic structure, etc., indeed, there are always problems. We want to address these problems through peaceful means, including dialogue or other means. This is not only in line with our both interests, this is also the expectations of the international community. Therefore, we really hope that both parties would take a responsible attitude to address this issue. Just now you said Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump, they have a very good personal relationship. Mr. Trump said many times he is a very good friend of Mr. Xi Jinping. Well, President Xi Jinping said more or less the same thing. Well, he has been carrying out very active dialogues with Mr. Trump, but unfortunately, our bilateral relationship is actually not necessarily going with the direction they expected, but we are further and further apart from each other. We want to negotiate, indeed. We want to consult with each other, we hope. The wisdom will certainly take the priority.
I hope you're right. Wisdom should always take priority. It's very good. Martina, you're dealing with Europe and Eurasia. You're dealing with varieties of trade. We were talking before about globalization and a kind of rising nationalism. Do you think for the world order these are conflictual, or do you think somehow they can work together?
Well, I think a little bit of both. I mean, traditionally, they have been seen as sort of opposite of each other, that globalization versus economic nationalism, but ultimately the two can be combined, as there is currently on the marketplace. When we look at these trade wars, ultimately, of course, in the short run, it affects the world, but in the long run, it will affect primarily the two nations which are at war, and the rest will benefit. And there has been some data from UNCTAD that actually shows the EU as the biggest beneficiary of the trade war between China and the US. So in the long run, actually, other nations can benefit from these trade wars that we're seeing. A second aspect, though, I think, which is important to consider, which we look at particularly, is that behind what we now describe as this trade war is what we call a tech war, a war for the race for technology and winning the race for technology, whether that's AI or data, or whatever you have. And we see huge investments from China, but also the US, and of course states or nations in the EU around those technologies. And ultimately, in the long run, those nations that will know how to manage these or sort of benefit from these technologies and master these technologies will be the winners. And it's not so much just about the trade itself, but actually the technology power.
As a non-Chinese, non-American, how do you view the debate over Huawei? Do you think the Americans
and I'm
pushing
also
it
Swiss,
too far,
so essentially neutral.
So you're neutral, yes. But you have an army.
We'll see how neutral.
Yeah.
Everyone serves in the army.
Yeah, exactly. But also we're an international institution, so we have essentially impartial. But of course, we see this debate as a very interesting one, and there's different elements of this, of course. I mean, of course, there needs to be an open competition, and competition is good, and we need innovation. We need to, allow partners to really push the boundaries around issues like cyber and other things. But there is, of course, the debate around the national infrastructure and how to protect critical infrastructure, and each nation in each state needs to make certain decisions on what areas they can and will share and with whom, and there's different allies, and I think we can't make a general statement, yes, let's open, let's not open. There needs to be sort of a gradual, I think, strategy of who has access to what and to what extent. And I'm sure like that is the same from each of the nations, including China, will make the same decisions.
Do you know, is Switzerland buying Huawei, or you don't know?
I don't know, but it's also a fact that we need to, strengthen our own companies and make sure that they can be able to compete at a global level and at an international level.
Well, one of the interesting...
I would love to join.
No, do, because I mean, one of the interesting things about this whole debate for me is that, I mean, basically, of the companies that do 5G, there isn't really an American one, which is part of the problem.
That's where I was going to begin. Our objection to Chinese technology in this case, sometimes it's about trying to move business from, a foreign competitor to the United States. In this case, to us, it's an existential black or white question. Huawei is an organ of the Chinese government. There is no question about that. They can dress themselves up as a separate private corporation, public-private corporation, but they're not. And the Chinese law currently allows for the Chinese government to request any of its companies to provide it whatever data it needs on an intelligence basis. That's black letter law. There's no debate about that.
Right.
So to the United States and its friends, we want them to get their technology anywhere they can get it other than China, because we are not willing to open our national secrets, the control of our cars, our hospitals, our government, our schools, our cities, under Chinese control. We're just not willing to do it.
Okay. No, I'm just...
Full stop.
No, that's fine. Before we go to Bobo, Mr. Yu, I wondered if you wanted to say anything to this point or just let it...
I really want to express one point. Well, first of all, I think no foreigner would know Huawei better than any Chinese. Indeed, Huawei is a fast developing private company. The technology of Huawei is very advanced. That is why it is it is so prominent in the world, but however, its technology is being built on the foreign technologies, including American technologies indeed. So it has been collaborating with foreign companies indeed. It has been very open. So if the product of Huawei, well, if you're afraid of losing your security because of the product of Huawei, I think you really lack self-confidence. No, we Chinese are using the iPhones, but however, we never feel unsafe. Now, this world is integrated indeed. We are more and more interrelated indeed. We are more and more learning from each other. This is inevitable. Well, nobody can stay outside the world. Indeed, this whole world is a chain. So each of us is the link of the chain. We cannot separate ourselves from the international community. Indeed, you should boost your own self-evidence. Huawei, the owner. Oh.
I mean, this is one of the points of this.
Okay, I stop it here.
Which is, this is the kind of strain we'll find in a global order that's shifting and changing.
Can I make a very
short?
No,
let me just. Let me finish a sentence, please, Mr. Ambassador, and then you can talk.
Thank you.
Thanks. Which is that we are now in a situation where, as Martina says, I think these trade tensions will not be resolved quickly. They'll probably be going on for 50 or 60 years. I mean, anyway, sir, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't want to imply that the quality of Huawei's technology is in any way inferior. It is a great technology. And I don't want to imply that there is necessarily, although there could be, but necessarily a backdoor to Huawei's software or hardware, because they don't need a backdoor. They can go through the front door. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, clear. Bobo, I'm sorry we've left you out, because I mean, part of this debate is also about Russia, your specialty. Sometimes I think we overestimate our worries about Russia, but I sometimes think we overestimate our worries about everything, about China too, because this is what keeps us in business, right? But one of the questions you and I were talking about, which I'd love to hear you about, in your view, what is the bigger risk to the global order? Is it Russia pressing on Europe? Is it China's rise? Or is it our own failings and fatigue?
Thank you, Steve. Let me start by making a distinction between Chinese and Russian attitudes towards the existing international system and their visions of a future, if you like, post-American order. Despite a lot of talk about Russian and Chinese views converging on these issues, I think that really is a gross misunderstanding. The Chinese have been the biggest beneficiaries of the US-led global order, Western-led globalization over the last 4 decades. They are consequently quite appreciative of the virtues of this order. What has changed, however, is that as China's rise has continued in spectacular fashion, they still want to operate within the existing international system, but they want enhanced status and influence within that system. So essentially, they're looking not for the destruction of the system, but for the reform of the system, at least as they understand it. Now, the Russian view is almost diametrically opposite. Their view of the international system is that this was imposed on them at the end of the Cold War, and that this system has systematically deprived them of both status and influence in the last few decades. So they see nothing good. So if China's been the prime beneficiary of the US-led global order, then Russia has been the big loser. So they see no redeeming features. Now, which means they are looking very much to a post-system, post-liberal world order. And what they really have in mind is a kind of Yalta 1945. So instead of having Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, you have Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin. And they, the big three, so to speak,
will divide the world.
Will co-manage the world. Now, of course, other powers and institutions will play roles, But essentially, it's the big three that decide. And Russia has a special role in this because Russia sees itself as a kind of swing power, the great balancer between China and the United States, the bridge between Europe and Asia. Now, the Chinese view is very different to that. The Chinese really see the world being, they still see the United States as the preeminent power, but they also see themselves as the unique global counterpart. Now, of course, other powers like Russia would still play important roles, but they would be on a level or several levels below. So the Chinese and Russian attitudes do differ fundamentally on issues of international organization and order and the future. However, their relations, respective relations with the United States are so difficult that they have tended naturally to work a little bit together because they both feel under tremendous pressure. So the Russians see the Chinese as giving them global status, because Russia without China would be not treated that seriously, at least outside Europe. But Russia with China suddenly becomes much more of a global player. The Chinese understand, however, that Russia, it's not so much they need Russia, but they need Russia not to be a pain in the ass, because I think
quite a lot of people would say the same.
They understand Russia still has tremendous disruptive power.
Yes. Mr. Yu, I wonder, the Chinese view of Russia, do you see Russia as somehow aiding China in its, call it, peaceful competition with the United States and with Europe? Or is Russia seen somehow as a source of raw material, a place to expand, a place to get wood and oil and gas, and not so important except in terms of nuclear weapons? Complicated, I'm sorry.
好像有点Well, the relationship between China and Russia, I believe it is in a very good state. Well, you have noticed Mr. Xi Jinping just concluded his visit to Moscow. Both heads of state declared that our relationship would be pushed up to a new stage. This is a new era comprehensive strategic partnership. What does this mean? Well, what do the Russians think? I don't dare to say, but however, such a new type of strategic partnership should firstly boost political mutual trust. Indeed, we are neighboring countries, we want to boost our mutual trust. Mr. Xi Jinping said in Moscow, indeed, we have experienced the ups and downs in our relationship, but now we are trying to boost our political mutual trust. Secondly, we would like to boost our economic cooperation. Indeed, the economic cooperation between China and Russia is far from the economic relation between us and the U.S. Well, last year, the trade volume between Russia is far less than the trade volume between China and the U.S. even after the trade disputes. Indeed, between China and Europe and Russia, just as Mr. Xi said, indeed, we need to boost our mutual trust and the people-to-people relationship. Indeed, these serve as the foundation for our good relationship. Well, last but not least, indeed, we should coordinate even more in the international institute. Indeed, now the global order is somehow worrying. Well, the global order is disrupted. The international law is not fully respected. Some international organizations are falling apart. Well, we don't allow this. We don't accept this. The world should be working towards divergence, indeed. Well, for example, we should build the common community of security and common community of governance, etc. Indeed, we should work together and we should walk together hand in hand. Indeed, well, energy is not the basic factor of the bilateral relationship. Indeed, it is one factor. It's not the basic factor.
I was reminded that the Vietnamese used to say they were as close to China as lips and teeth, but they bit each other quite a lot Martina, if I could ask you, how do you see this Russia-China relationship? Do you see it as having its own tensions built in, or do you think it somehow can work to change the world order as it is?
Well, I think the question is it's quite clear that China has ambitions and a strategy in the long run. It's maybe less obvious from the Russia side, apart from disrupting here and there and trying to have, interventions here and there. But what is that sort of 5-year plan or the longer term, bigger ambition behind Russian strategy? I think that's kind of the key question. And we see them pivoting towards Europe, towards China, towards Eurasia, whatever, it's sort of, I think, not clear what is their longer term ambition and strategy in the same way that it is for other nations or regions in the sense of Europe.
And right now in Russia, there's an awful lot of discussion about what happens after VV Putin.
Right.
Can I just
yeah, sure.
come in on this? Russia, in the same way that it's opposed the idea of a US-led global order, has even less interest in a China-led global order. Because either way, Russia does not become an independent center of global power with the strategic flexibility to punch above its weight. And that's really important. That's why Putin, in a sense, is not committing entirely towards China, why he's kept open a personal rapport with Donald Trump, why he's reaching out to the European mainstream, having flirted with the European far right, and why he's also diversifying relations across Asia, not just Japan, India, Pakistan, and even that traditional backwater of Russian foreign policy, Southeast Asia.
Right. I just want to ask you, sitting in Brussels, where do you find European anxieties? Are they more about Russia, or are they more about China, or are they more about Donald Trump?
Well, they're about Russia because of geography. They're about China because they are nervous that they don't really understand where our relationship with China is going. And as a result, given the fact that we don't have a comprehensive bona fide free trade agreement with Europe today, our dealings with China make them nervous. We are fighting on multiple fronts, and again, I say that in a non-military sense.
Right.
But look, we share values with Europe that we do not share with Russia and China, and never will, probably.
Yeah.
It is in our mutual interest to put our trade differences and some of our other differences, which in the context of everything that's been talked about this morning, this afternoon, are minor in comparison, because they're not existential differences. The other differences are existential. Put those aside, form a partnership in whatever form that takes, because together we're $1 trillion of trade and a $40 trillion combined GDP. At that point, our ability to impose our own mutual standards of conduct, of product quality, of safety, of rule of law is unparalleled, which at the end of the day is really to China's and Russia's benefit.
Yeah.
As well.
Do you think, sometimes the president has talked more favorably about a TTIP kind of arrangement in Asia? Obviously, he didn't like the one the Obama administration did, but do you think there's potential for reviving something like that?
I'm very skeptical about that. TTIP collapsed of its own weight. It was far too complicated. Donald Trump likes straightforward and simple. And he also likes to do what every business person likes to do, which is to pick low-hanging fruit. When you have the ability to close a deal on something simple that you can close tomorrow and put some energy into that, which takes very little, as opposed to slogging through the mud for years, you first pick all the low-hanging fruit, and that's what we're trying to do right now.
Right. And if you're Jean-Claude Juncker, you hold out a big bag of, let's buy these soybeans.
That's the shiny object, although I don't think soybeans are very shiny.
But they could be in a big aluminum foil bag.
Can I just pick up a point?
Yes.
There's a lot of talk about China posing an existential threat. And I wonder whether the word existential is too loosely flung around. I don't actually see the Chinese wanting a different world system at all, because they've been real beneficiaries of the current system. It can do with some tweaking, some reforming as they see it, as I mentioned. But they don't want to create a new system. And not because they're nice people, they share our values, or it's nothing to do with that. It's naked self-interest. It's incredibly difficult to create a post-American, post-liberal world order. And they don't want to be saddled with this kind of responsibility. They don't want to be the go-to power. Rather, what they want to do is exploit the advantages and the shortcomings of the existing system.
You know, I've always been, you know, we always see this as China learning how to behave globally, right? Even at the United Nations, China's almost, I don't think, has ever used a veto. It abstains, but it never actually vetoes anything. And in some ways, when people have pushed China to take larger global roles, China has demurred. Right? It's like, but I do wonder if this is changing, Mr. Yu. I mean, Mr. Xi's language is much tougher. Some people inside China criticize him for not listening to Deng Xiaoping and not keeping the light hidden or dim while China grows. I mean, do you think those critics are wrong? Or do you think Mr. Xi has perhaps scared people too early?
I think this is not necessary. President Xi Jinping, well, in China, he is indeed a very strong leader. He has a very, very clear target. He wants to take the Chinese nation to a rejuvenation, if you want, because China is a country with 1.3 billion people over 100 years. We've been living in poverty. Well, since reform and opening up, indeed, well, in the 1970s, more than 700 people could not feed themselves. Well, after the reforms, they were lifted out of poverty, and we are walking towards the international stage, or at least not the center of the stage, but at the edge of the stage. Well, the contribution of China in the economy is already more than 30%. We are the second economy in the world. Well, indeed, we are the #1 country of trade of goods. Well, therefore, you guys should not be afraid of China's development. We have never been forming any ally or a military ally with any other country. Indeed, well, the wars, the regional wars or the special wars were all launched by the United States, never by China. So we are peaceful people. We talk about the peaceful harmony, peaceful coexistence. We talk about harmony, etc. Now we stick to peaceful development, and we want to drive the development of our neighboring countries through peaceful development, so as to see the development of the world. Isn't this good? Indeed. Now we are all talking about globalization. Just now you said over decades China has been benefiting a lot from the globalization. Indeed. If we close our door, this is not good. We really need to open our economy. We need to develop our economy in a Chinese way. Indeed, China needs to work towards the world. But this is a two-way. Mr. President Xi Jinping is very clear. We also hope to see the international community to work towards China. And indeed, we are trying to reform ourselves. We're trying to change ourselves. But indeed, the whole world cannot change China. There is a process here. Indeed, we want to see the world working towards us, and China will work towards the world. And we want to make more contributions to the world. Some countries are worrying that the development of China would perhaps Well, for example, Mr. Trump called Mr. Carter saying, we really hope that China would surpass the United States. I don't think this is an attitude a big power should take. Indeed, we should co-develop. We should take into account each other's interests, indeed, especially the interests of security. Well, indeed, that's true.
I'm happy to hear.
Something.
Well, I'm happy to hear that China is doing so well. Perhaps they would be willing to now elect normal status instead of developing country status
in the WTO.
In the WTO, because I don't think you're a developing country any longer, and I think that sort of makes a mockery out of the classification, which has a lot of ramifications. There are other countries, but China is probably the most conspicuous. Look, if China would stop stealing other people's technology and develop their own, that would solve a lot of problems. They would find a lot more collaboration from the US and US companies, which are kind of over the China excitement. In my travels around the United States, speaking with CEOs of companies, if I had these conversations 5 or 10 years ago, they would have been giddy about all of the opportunities in China, and they've now pulled back significantly, having nothing to do with Donald Trump, having nothing to do with the current administration or the current environment, but having to do simply with their own parochial business experiences, which is their secrets, their technologies, their crown jewels are being taken on a daily basis, and they're tired of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, this has been the big complaint. Even the European Union has started to criticize and see China as in an economic rivalry. So, I mean, Martina, I was just curious how this affects the Davos notion of the liberal world order.
Well,
maybe that's unfair. I'm sorry, but that's where you're from.
Now we're going to see Swiss neutrality.
Yeah, exactly. But the Davos notion is just the compilation of basically what is happening. It's a reflection, it's a mirror of what's going on in the world, right? And I think what we have been saying or sort of advocating also is to think about how globalization is evolving and what we need to do to maybe prevent also some of the ails of globalization, because it has in reality created winners and losers, and it's not about nation states only, it's about the global system. And how do we create a system where it's not just this individualistic mercantile thinking where it's got a trickle-down effect and some benefit and some don't and some are on the losing end, but how do we create societies and economies and markets that are fair, that are, can benefit more people and create a system which is a bit more advanced and a bit more progressive?
Do you think or worry or reflect a worry some in Europe have that they're somehow going to be pulled between China and the United States in terms of regulations and trade?
I think Europe has its own way, and we've seen that with the GDPR, this data law that was enacted. I think Europe is never going to be the center of the world. Let's be realistic. But it does have very strong values, as you've alluded to as well, and I think it has to be more assertive around that, whether it's sustainability or the social values or technology values, whatever that might be. But also it has clearly in this context that we're discussing to step up its game when it comes to its ambitions on a geopolitical level. It just cannot continue to sort of meddle through as it has been in the past. It needs to be more assertive. It has to take more stances, whether that's on the spending side, but also on being more decisive on certain decisions when it comes to security and geopolitical issues.
This is why the new commission, I think, will be quite interesting to see how powerful it is and how, because one of the things that, I've been thinking about is, one of the great challenges to order are things that we don't often discuss, that are all around us, like climate change, migration, poverty, demographics in Russia, in Europe, in Africa, in China, in India. We haven't even talked about India here. So I'm curious, just to anybody, how do these kinds of things, do you think, how will they change what we think of as this post-Cold War order?
Sure. In many ways, I feel we're missing the point in our threat perceptions about global order. We think in very much 19th, 20th century notions of geopolitics, geopolitical contestation, great power rivalries, whereas we need to be thinking about broader global threats that threaten us, by definition, that threaten us all. So in a sense, the geopolitical competition is completely missing the point. We need to work together in combating climate change, in addressing global poverty. And these are sort of, it's not about who's top, who's hegemonic, who's counter-hegemonic. I mean, these are just red herrings, ultimately. It's unless we find ways to improve the mechanisms of the existing international system, then all this other stuff is just rubbish. And this is what really worries me. It's too easy to blame the Russians or Chinese or other non-democratic powers for the troubles of the existing international system. There are many problems that we need to be addressing first. The gulf between pious sentiments and pathetic inaction or counteraction on one hand. The failing...
That's a very difficult challenge.
That is.
That is hard.
But because it's hard, people in a sense are sort of, they think, oh, too hard. Let's go to something that's more comprehensible, that's easier to attack, easier to address. Another problem is the vast gulf between, the virtues of democratic governance, liberal democratic governance, and yet the failings on the ground of this same liberal governance. We need to demonstrate that liberal democracy isn't just virtuous, but is actually the most effective means of governing ourselves and, in a sense, presenting an example to the international.
Yes, because I mean, part of what strikes me as I think about our own deficits and problems is that, the promise we always make to our citizens, particularly in the West, is a better life, your children have a better life. It's not clear the European Union has succeeded in providing that. It's not clear in the United States, when I look at my own stagnant salary, for years, that the American promise too has proved very hard to fulfill in this new global context of digital life. The old joke, which I've always liked, is that future factories will have only one man and one dog. And the man's job will be to feed the dog, and the dog's job will be to keep the man from touching anything. And this is great if you believe in the Marxist world of a little work and a lot of thinking under the tree, but it is a betrayal. And then we look at places, not just China, look at other places that do not call themselves democracies, that are more authoritarian. Are they delivering better in this new world to their citizens? I don't know the answer, but that's one of the questions.
Well, in theory, they could be if they weren't corrupt. And if the fruits of everyone's labor weren't going into very few pockets. If the idea is the redistribution of wealth, then you have to redistribute the wealth. And the wealth is not being redistributed. It's being pocketed by a handful of people in a lot of these countries who are creating this stagnant situation. Look, to put in a plug for my own country, we are and have been and always will be the most generous country on earth, generous to others. The amount of aid that we supply, don't laugh, the amount of aid that we supply on a global basis to countries needing it exceeds what any other country does on any basis that you want to measure.
And there's a lot of private charity too.
And there's a lot of private charity too, and a lot of philanthropy. Just to finish the point, we need to have a successful business climate, both internally and externally, in order to continue to have the resources to fulfill that mission. Because that is part of our DNA. And we wish that our friends in Europe and elsewhere around the world would join us in those endeavors.
Right. Okay. But talking about redistribution of wealth, of making sure that enough people lead decent material lives, China in the last few decades has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. This over the same period that income inequalities have increased drastically in the West. So which is the more effective? Now, I agree in some ways these places are notorious for their corruption. But whatever one thinks about Xi Jinping, and I think he's made a number of bad errors, but I think one relative success is addressing at least some of the worst cases of corruption. I don't get this because I read.
I wasn't referring to China.
No, but I mean, I'm just saying that. But in a way, the Chinese would say, look, we're less corrupt than we were. Beijing, at least, is a less polluted city than it was a few years ago. And meanwhile, there's an enormous Chinese middle class. So by the criteria of good governance, we're actually ticking many of the boxes. And maybe this is a fallacy, distinguishing between authoritarianism on the one hand and democracy on the other. Maybe we should just be distinguishing between good governance and bad governance.
Oh, no. At some point, you still have to distinguish between respect for human rights and lack of respect for human rights.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, but that is
you
one
can
criterion.
have
That's
you
one
can
criterion.
have, you can have the best governance in the world, but if you don't have human rights, you have an efficient economic system.
While the two of them discuss this, I would like to get some questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left, and so if it's possible, I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions, and if you wouldn't mind trying to address them to a particular person, but if you can't, okay, sir. And could you identify yourself for everyone? Thank you. Yeah, it's fine.
Excuse me. I'm Huang Wei from China. Ambassador, I respect U.S. very much.
Thank you.
My question is related to 5G of Huawei. U.S. advised its airlines not to accept any Huawei equipment based on your suspicion of Huawei might do some secret activities in the Chinese official direction. But up till now, U.S. has not given out any proof of Huawei such kind of activities.
Could you turn it into a question?
Yeah. So is this judgment of U.S. based on the U.S. experience of yourself?
Okay. That's a good question.
Good. And any other questions?
Yes.
Mr. Taylor, identify
Hello,
yourself.
Paul Taylor. I'm a columnist with Politico and a researcher with Friends of Europe. Bobo, I loved your framing of the global order. So I suppose I'd ask you, to what extent do you think that Western, particularly US policies, have sort of pushed Russia and China into each other's arms in a sort of reverse Kissinger? And what policies might it take to prize them now apart?
Okay.
Easy question.
Yeah. Another question, or we...
Here, I have a mic.
Okay,
please.
very good.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I'd like to take a...
Could you identify yourself?
Maciej Pisarski, I'm with the policy planning of the Polish Foreign Ministry. And I would like to accept the challenge of Mr. Babelov and kind of actually provide some example of where the Western-style liberal democracy works. It's enough to walk outside this building and look around and see how this country has progressed over the last 30 years, to see how this system works. And it's not only Slovakia, it's also Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and others. So what it means is that actually you can combine
kind of political pluralism, democratic values, with the kind of economic modernization. So you can have a ruble and you have spent it as well. So there is another. But my question to you, sir, is the following: I understand your argument that Russia would not like to, live in the Chinese-led world order. But frankly speaking, it is very unlikely that such a world order may materialize very soon. So Russia probably will not be facing this dilemma in a short-term scenario. But can you imagine or foresee a situation in which Russia would side with the West or United States against China in the short term? Yeah?
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. So, Gordon, do you want to directly answer?
Sure.
This gentleman first.
You asked if we have direct proof that Huawei has, I believe, acted in a malign way, or the Chinese government through Huawei. And I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is that why would you take the risk as a country when 5G is really, as a digression, is really a mislabeled technology? It sounds like it's the next iteration of 4G, which is maybe your cell phone will work a little better, you'll be able to download your social media faster. That is not what 5G is about. 5G will operate everything in your country. It will operate your airplanes, your cars, your schools, your hospitals. Surgeons will perform operations on 5G. So I would pose the question, why take the risk with a party that has already have a treasured legacy of meddling, stealing technology, and other malign activities around the world? Why turn the keys to your country over to that technology or to that country when you can have technology that is in the hands of what I would call a friendly actor, which is a private company in a Western democracy?
Though it's much more expensive, so far.
So far.
Okay. No, it's good. But did you want?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first. You don't need to tell me about the virtues of liberal democracy as a form of governance. I live in Brighton, the most liberal city in the United Kingdom. So I am absolutely a supporter of liberal democracy. But what I feel has been lost is that people have assumed that liberal democracy by itself is a kind of automatically sort of running machine, and that we've been sloppy, that we have taken its virtues for granted, and so that in many cases it's actually been, it's stagnated. So we've become complacent in the West. We've assumed that because we're liberal democracies, therefore we have good governance. And I think that kind of lazy, complacent thinking has actually discredited liberal democracy, not just in non-democracies, but across much of the democratic West. So that's my problem. Now, you asked me about a potential conflict between Russia and China. I think as long as China's and Russia's respective relations with the United States are so difficult, I don't see it. But looking a little bit further ahead, I see two potential areas where things could get awkward. One is that the Belt and Road Initiative proliferates so effectively across Eurasia that Russia essentially loses its position as the traditional heartland power. And the other area is the Arctic. Because the present rate of global warming and what we're seeing is that the Arctic, which used to be a kind of an academic issue, you know, in 30, 40 years' time it'll be commercially navigable, is actually a much more pressing issue today. And the Chinese and Russians have fundamentally opposed views on the Arctic. The Russians see the Arctic as part of their territorial waters. the Chinese see the Arctic as part of a common global good. So their attitude towards the Arctic is the same as they see the Antarctic.
But that's not the way they see the South China Sea.
But that's a different issue. Of course, horses for courses. No one said there wasn't a large amount of hypocrisy. But can I answer just Phil's, Paul's question? I know the Americans are trying to, in a sense, wean Putin away from the Chinese. But it won't work. And why? Because the Russians see President Trump as fundamentally unreliable. They see the US political establishment as essentially hostile. And therefore, China, for all its many faults, for all their long-term concerns about what may or may not be its ambitions, nevertheless represents a much more reliable strategic option for the foreseeable future.
Mr. Yu, I wondered whether you wanted to comment on this Russia-China relationship as expressed by Mr. Taylor.
Just now, you guys were talking a lot. I think everything you were talking about could be boiled down to one point. Well, this world is becoming more and more complicated. The international relationship is less and less predictable, especially the relationship between the major powers. Indeed, this is very dangerous. I hope that we can work together to maintain the balance between the major powers. Indeed, we are more and more interactive, we're more and more interrelated. Indeed, we should not talk negatively about others. Indeed, we should not talk about other countries with very nasty words. Just now we talked about whether China has stolen the business secrets. Well, if China has done so, then you just go to the international organizations. You should not take this for granted without any solid proof. Indeed, when we talk about technology, yeah, you have surpassed me in one aspect, but I might be better in other aspects. Indeed, well, the advancement of humankind is the result of common efforts. We talk about freedom or democracy. Indeed, the international society is a big family indeed in the world. The culture is diverse. So is the development model indeed. The values are all diverse and multifaceted. Indeed, we do not want, well, otherwise, if we do not recognize this, we will see another Cold War. Indeed, the values can never be aligned with each other. We should not try to align our values. Indeed, we have experienced different civilizations. We have experienced different development paths. Indeed, we need to learn from each other. We need to boost our mutual understanding. We should not talk negatively about each other. We should not finger point. Yes, indeed. Otherwise, this would cause chaos or regression of the world. Thank you very much.
Ideally, we work out a set of understandings that all sides can follow, but that doesn't always happen very easily. Martina, I wondered whether you had a view on this, and also just to sort of ask you, I mean, do you see the United States as a declining power? And if so, what replaces it?
Well, I think what hasn't come up enough here is how Europe is much more divided than it ever was. And I think the weak link is actually Europe, not the United States. And I think for its own purpose, for its strategic purposes in the long run of being more ambitious and solving some of its issues internally, it needs to be even more united, but also as a partner to either China, the US, or Russia, or whoever it is, to Africa, which also hasn't been really coming up, which is a major, link and an influencing factor, what is happening in Africa. It needs to be more united. And this is a really important aspect, I think, if we talk about global order without a united and strong Europe for its own purposes, but also for its partners' purposes. It doesn't bode well for the future.
We've only got 3 minutes left. I wondered if you had a quick
Thank you very much.
Sorry, and I'm sorry I didn't see you before.
Okay, no problem. My name is Ilaf. I'm Iraqi diplomat. Actually, I have two questions. The first is for His Excellency. Mr. Liu has mentioned twice the post-American order, global order. do you agree, or what reflections do you have on these assumptions?
And second?
And the second is, very briefly, Mr. Lu, if you just explain to us your assumptions that Russia needs China, China gives Russia a strategic weight out of Europe. Can you explain in the game, the power game in the case within the case of Syria? Thank you.
Okay. Interesting. Do you want to go first? I try to keep it brief.
Well, I'm unsurprisingly a big believer in American exceptionalism. And I'm a believer in American exceptionalism because traditionally we've been open to all comers that come to us on a legal basis. We are a generous and philanthropic country, again, not because I think we are, but because measured by the data. And we want a peaceful and democratically run world. And I think that so long as our trading and military adversaries choose to put their energy into mischief rather than into productively working and collaboratively working with us to achieve that goal. And I'm not saying that every other power needs to run its government the way the United States does. We have many shortcomings as well. We are not perfect by any means. But at least our ambitions are fairly clear and fairly benign. And so that's where I see the future.
Okay. And just before Bubba answers, as an experiment, I don't know if any of you have dealt with Slido.com at all. Yes? Okay, good. Well, I had asked them to put a one poll question that I hope you can see. I don't know how you answer it, but please try to do it. I'll read it to you. It's, are you confident that after this discussion, the world will have any kind of global order 50 years from now? Yes or no? Oh, well, whoops. So while the votes are tallied, Bobo, you want to
Sure,
respond?
just three quick points. First issue about exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. However well-intentioned, however well-meaning, the problem of American exceptionalism is that it encourages exceptionalism in other great powers, real and wannabes.
We would like those to join us.
But they want an exceptionalism maybe of a different kind, and that's been part of the problem. That's why we're discussing this issue today. But look, on a post-American order, I just wanted to clarify a point here. Post-American order, America would still be the preeminent power. But what it would not be would be a US-dominated order in the same way that it's been for, say, the post-Cold War period. Coming to China, Russia, and the Middle East, and at the moment, Russia is the big external hitter in the Middle East. But the big challenge that Russia faces is to try and keep all the balls in the air. So it's got reasonably good relations with all the competing parties, from Saudis to Iranians to Israelis to the Syrians. But at the moment, what can it do? It can win the Syrian conflict, but what can it do in the longer term? And that's where China comes in. China is only a very marginal player in the Middle East, a marginal political player at least. But try and fast forward, say, 10 years' time. I see China's economic influence translating into increasing political and even geopolitical influence. I see Russia maybe struggling to deliver and to keep all the balls in the air, so that over a period of time, it'll be China rather than Russia that will be the leading non-Western external power in the region. Now, therefore, in those circumstances, for Russia to be to be close to the Chinese at least gives them a status beyond their real, their actual influence.
Okay, that's a wonderful place to end, I think.
Looks like we won.
I do appreciate your optimism. I don't know what that shape of global order will be, but we will have one. Thank you all very, very much, and thank the panel.
Thank you all.
I think now there's a coffee break, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next session in the Marie-Thérèse will be at 4:30. It's entitled 5G, Geopolitics of the Network.